On September 5, 1997, Virgin Atlantic Flight 024 was flying from Los Angeles to London with 114 people on board. It was a normal journey until everything went wrong just minutes before landing. The flight was nearly over, the passengers were relaxed, and the crew was getting ready to land. But what they didn't know was that the landing gear, one of the most critical parts of the plane, wasn't working right. What followed was a terrifying emergency landing at Heathrow Airport. Sparks flew as the plane slid down the runway with one side dragging on the ground. Inside, people were bracing for impact, not knowing if they'd make it out alive. So what really happened? Why did the landing gear fail? And how did the pilots keep control of a plane that couldn't land properly? Stick around because this is the intense, true story of how Flight 024 turned into a fight for survival. It was a calm, clear night in Los Angeles. The date was September 5th, 1997, and passengers were arriving at the airport, checking in their bags for the long overnight journey to London Heathrow. Many were excited, some were tired, but all expected a normal flight. The announcement came. We have just finished loading and will soon start taxiing to the runway. The flight should take place according to the scheduled time. Their aircraft was a 4-year-old Airbus A340-300, a modern jet, big, reliable, and safe. It had 4 engines and a strong safety record. This plane was built to handle long trips across oceans, and that night, it would become Virgin Atlantic Flight 24. The flight was scheduled to take about 10.5 hours from Los Angeles. It would head out over the Pacific for a moment, then curve across North America and the Atlantic Ocean before touching down in the UK the next afternoon. In the cockpit, 3 pilots were getting ready. Captain Tim Barnby, 40 years old, was in command. He had over 14,000 hours of flight time and nearly 3,000 hours on the A340. He was calm, skilled, and confident. He had seen a lot, but this flight would test him like never before. Sitting next to him was First Officer Andrew Moley, 32 years old. He was fairly new to the A340, with just over 300 hours on the jet. But he wasn't a rookie, having flown over 4,500 hours on other Airbus planes. Behind them sat the relief pilot, First Officer Craig Empton, just 28 years old. Like Moley, he had just under 300 hours on the A340, but also had more than 4,500 hours total. He would take over for short stretches during the cruise so the others could rest. As the 13 cabin crew helped passengers settle in, bags were being loaded. The plane was filled with 73 metric tons of fuel for the long trip. At just before 9 p.m., slightly behind schedule, the cabin doors were closed. Flight 024 was ready to go. The engines roared to life one by one, and the aircraft slowly began to taxi toward runway 24 left. Everyone on board thought this would be a routine overnight flight, but what they didn't know was that danger was already waiting for them. At 9:09 p.m. local time, Virgin Atlantic Flight 024 finally took off from Los Angeles International Airport. The flight was about 19 minutes behind schedule, but that was nothing unusual. As the Airbus A340-300 lifted into the night sky, everything seemed normal at first. But during the climb, the flight crew noticed something odd. The landing gear was taking longer than usual to retract. It eventually did, but the delay caught their attention. Later, during a routine check of the systems, the pilot spotted another small issue. The brake temperature sensor for wheel number 6 had failed. This was one of the inboard rear wheels on the main landing gear. Despite these warnings, the plane was flying fine, with no major alarms, so the flight continued. The night was calm, passengers relaxed, and flight attendants served meals. The aircraft cruised smoothly through the sky. But just as they were getting close to London, the calm turned to chaos. At 3:04 p.m. GMT, the plane was on final approach to land on runway 27L at Heathrow. The first officer, who was flying the aircraft at the time, lowered the landing gear. Suddenly, an oral warning echoed in the cockpit: gear unsafe. This meant the system could not confirm that the landing gear was properly down and locked. At just 2.7 miles from the runway, the pilots made a quick decision. They aborted the landing and climbed away. They entered a holding pattern, circling in the air while trying to figure out what was wrong. The crew contacted air traffic control and asked if someone could visually inspect the gear. They flew the plane close to the control tower so that controllers could take a look from the ground. It was clear the left main landing gear, which supports the left side of the plane, was partially deployed. It had come down but was not fully extended or locked into place. The pilots tried to fix it in several ways. They used the gravity drop system, a backup that lets the gear fall into place using its own weight. They flew in tight turns, hoping the movement would shake it free. They followed procedures carefully one after another, but nothing worked. At one point, the crew thought about trying something risky. They planned to touch the plane down lightly on the right main landing gear, then take off again. The idea was to bounce the aircraft, hoping the jolt would force the left gear to lock into place. But after more discussion, they decided not to attempt it. It was simply too dangerous, especially with passengers on board. Now, they were running out of time. They had been circling for over an hour, burning fuel, while trying every possible solution. At 4:08 p.m. GMT, the fuel was almost gone. They had no choice left. The captain declared an emergency. Mayday. It was time to land the crippled aircraft, even if that meant landing with only one main landing gear down. The pilots prepared for an emergency landing. They aimed once again for runway 27 left. They planned the approach so that the aircraft would land on the right gear first, then tilt left, away from airport buildings and toward open space. As the plane touched the runway, engine number 4 on the far right wing scraped the ground. The right main landing gear tires exploded from the stress. As the aircraft leaned to the left, engines 1 and 2 on the left wing also struck the runway. Within seconds, flames erupted under the wing as metal tore into the ground. The plane skidded sideways, veering off the center line, and finally came to a stop. As soon as the plane stopped, the cabin crew jumped into action. Emergency slides were deployed, and passengers began evacuating the aircraft. There was no panic, but it was a tense and frightening moment. 7 people suffered minor injuries during the evacuation, but no one died. It was a miraculous safe landing under impossible conditions. But the big question remained. How could this happen to a modern, well-maintained aircraft like the Airbus A340? That's what the investigators needed to find out. The investigation revealed what was surprising and a little alarming. The reason the left main landing gear didn't fully come down was because a metal rod got stuck. Here's how it happened. Inside the landing gear system, there's a brake torque rod. Its job is to help the brakes work properly and handle the force when the plane slows down. But on this flight, something went wrong. After takeoff from Los Angeles, a pin that was holding the rod in place came loose. Once the pin came out, one end of the rod started swinging freely. Then, when the pilots tried to lower the landing gear before landing, the loose rod got jammed inside the structure of the plane, like a wrench stuck in the gears. This is what stopped the left gear from coming all the way down. So why did the pin come out? That pin was meant to stay locked in tightly, but over time, the pin and the parts holding it had been under more pressure than expected. Why? Because of tiny movements and flexing inside the wheel and brake parts when the plane landed and braked. Also, the way the parts were assembled earlier may not have left enough space for the pin to move properly. This mistake wasn't spotted, so it stayed hidden. Eventually, the pressure built up and the pin gave out. This whole brake system had passed its safety test before being used on real planes. But those tests didn't fully copy what happens during real landings. For example, the test didn't include the way the axle bends slightly under pressure. That bending is what caused all the extra stress in the real world. Because of this, the test never showed how the rod and pin might fail. So, even though everything seemed fine on paper, in real life under real flying conditions, the system had a hidden flaw. In the end, it wasn't a single mistake. It was a chain of small issues. All of these came together on one unlucky flight. Virgin Atlantic Flight 024, but thanks to the pilot's skill and calm thinking, a disaster was avoided. This story reminds us how every small part on a plane matters and how skill, training, and calm decision-making can save hundreds of lives. If you found this story interesting, give it a like and share it with someone who loves aviation stories. Don't forget to subscribe to Air Crash for more real-life survival stories from the skies. Got a flight you want us to cover next? Drop it in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and as always, safe travels.